Okay, we'll call this Republican Ascendancy Part 1. I'm going to start skipping along pretty fast here. We got through with the great screwed up election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson won. And the basically three main topics that I have to do to get you ready to take exam 3. I have to jump ahead about 12 to 15 years. So the things, and we're going to lean on the supplement this time. That's why I wrote it. So Jefferson's first term, 2 really big things. You need to read up on those. Prepare for at least multiple choice questions about them. I would say the most significant Supreme Court decision ever, Marbury versus Madison, 1803. I posted a little explanatory video about it, which is pretty good, although it doesn't tell you why Chief Justice Marshall ruled the way he did. The explanation of the supplement does. And same year, the Louisiana Purchase. How did that come to be? Jefferson's easily reelected in 1804. A lesson for politicos. They never learn lessons anyway, so why try? If you're in politics and you tell the voters that if the other guy wins, the sky will fall and the earth will be consumed by fire, and the other guy wins anyway, and the sky doesn't fall and the earth is not consumed by fire, you're not going to be looking that good. So Jefferson did not set up guillotines. He didn't burn all the Bibles. He didn't have any sex orgies in the White House. Had to wait till the 1990s for that. Well, he's basically a generally, B plus 19th century president. But he gets reelected easily against a somewhat resurgent Federalist Party. In his second term, the foreign policy situation blew up. Napoleon plunged Europe into war, and by the time the dust settled and the smoke cleared, and it didn't take 2 years for that to happen, you got a two-nation standoff, and they can't hit each other. You got France, which is completely dominant on land. You got Britain, which is completely dominant at sea. They're at war. They can't hit each other. What they're left with is trying to freeze each other out of trade with the rest of the world, which to a great extent meant us. So this is going to lead us over a period of about 5 years into a second war with Great Britain known as the War of 1812. So read about that in the supplement. It's not necessarily the most gripping stuff, but you're going to run into more of that before your life's over. How we got caught in the middle, and why we elected to fight Britain instead of France. We had about equal reason for each one. Anyway, Jefferson is going to leave office under a cloud, replaced by yet another Republican, James Madison, who at the end of his first term presides over our going to war with Britain. I'm not going to spend time telling you why the supplement does that. I'm also not going to do a play-by-play on the war, except to tell you that the reason we wanted to fight Britain was that we wanted Canada. He was still part of the British Empire. Everyone had assumed that Canada would someday be part of the United States. That wasn't even worth talking about. It's going to happen. But one of the ironies about the beginning of the War of 1812 was that we didn't mention our real reason for going to war in the War Declaration. Okay? British practice of impressment on the high seas, find out what that was. And supposedly they're sponsoring a powerful hostile Indian Confederation in the Northwest. Those are just convenient excuses to declare war on Britain, which we believe was completely tied down fighting Napoleon in Europe and would not be able to spare the resources to defend Canada against a determined American attack. Looked good on paper. Didn't work out so well in actuality. What's missing from the picture is the determined American attack. All right? The politicians who set this up assumed that there'd be, support for the war. There really wasn't that much. They authorized expanding the army to 35,000 men, but only about 20% of that number volunteered. We're not going to have a draft, so they had to rely on state militias. State militias could not be depended on even to march outside their own states. So we stumbled out of the blocks in that war. And by 1814, forget Canada. We're just trying to make sure we're just praying we keep our independence, because this thing got grim. Napoleon was supposed to keep the Brits tied down, but he went off and invaded Russia instead. And yeah, right, that's going to work out. And Napoleon is off. He's forced into retirement by early 1814. He made a comeback, but we're looking at the wrong end of the might of the British Empire. And but Britain's exhausted after being at war for almost 22 years, and they settled the war. Two ironies about the end of the war. Read what details there are in the supplement. One was that the peace treaty did not mention either our stated or our unstated goals for going to war. The peace treaty, which was agreed upon at Christmas of 1814 in Belgium, merely restored the status quo ante bellum. That's Latin for the way things were before the war. So we got no concessions, we got no territory, we didn't give up any territory. It's a wash. Okay, that war is not it's not a win, it's not really a defeat either. It just might as well not have happened as far as the war aims are concerned. The other was, and this is important for other reasons, by far the biggest battle of the war was fought 2 weeks after the treaty was agreed upon, but way too soon for anybody to have heard about it. The Battle of New Orleans on January 8th, 1815 will be a huge catalyst for nationalism, the advent of USA nationalism. That's the main thing the war did. It turned us for the first time into raging, screaming USA nationalists, which we really hadn't been up to that point, and it transformed Andrew Jackson into a potential political superstar. So the main side effect of the war is nationalism. So our topic here, and I probably can't get through it with this video, but it'll move along. Nationalism after the War of 1812. To be followed by another topic, and they're like twin stars orbiting around each other, sectionalism after that. So to distinguish, nationalism is when people identify with and take pride in their nation as a whole rather than some part of it. Okay? As had been the case before. Sectionalism is when people become they don't really stop being nationalistic, they just get suspicious of the other sections. And yes, we've divided unofficially into 3 sections, and I'll tell you about that when we get to sectionalism. But it's like by the end of that decade, by 1819 or so, nationalism is having to scoot over and make room for a counter trend we call sectionalism. All right. Taking pride in the nation as a whole. All right. Prior to that, people still identified primarily with their state. They saw themselves as citizens of their state, and their state was secondarily part of the United States. And I don't know if they were still calling people from other states foreigners, but it wasn't coming along quickly. Now, modern nationalism was born in the early 1790s in France. It's a child of the French Revolution. When the French Revolution was in its most radical phase, France found itself at war with all its neighbors, invaded on all fronts. Okay, this is dangerous. And the enemy was fighting basically against the French people in an effort to restore the French monarchy. Well, things were different. Citizen armies rallied to the colors and struggled to repel the invaders. Someone wrote a stirring song called the Marseillaise, which is still the French national anthem. It got all emotional. There comes nationalism, which made France very strong and dangerous. And it spread across Europe. England had been the only country that was even remotely nationalistic, because England had been politically united since the 8th century, make that 9th century. Nobody else had. See, France had been divided into 22 provinces, each with its own history, dialect, system of weights and measures, system of laws, and they had histories, shall we say, going back. Germany would continue to be divided. It had been for several centuries until they achieved unification in 1871. Italy, same thing, unification in 1866. America, 13 colonies, which became the original 13 states. and people still identified with their state because it had histories preceding becoming part of the United States. So we become nationalists. The war, we would have become nationalistic anyway because it's like the virus going around, and sooner or later we're going to catch it. Over time, came a lot quicker because of the war. Now, the war had victories and defeats, stirring victories and embarrassing defeats. We'll do the embarrassments first. Okay? How would we feel about it if our national capital had been sacked and burned by enemy forces during a war? Next time somebody jars you awake at 4:15 in the morning, shines a flashlight in your eyes, and demands to know if the U.S. Capitol has ever been captured by the enemy during war, the answer to that happens to be yes. Okay? We had invasions that just fell flat of their face. We lost battles. And sometimes I like to bring in a kind of high school football analogy. Let's say you've got some little town out here and they got their little football team and they're just hopeless. They barely even score any points. They just stagger from defeat to defeat. And although probably nobody's going to be their friend, nobody's proud of them, but I want you to look at the fact that those boys keep strapping on that gear every week, going out on that field knowing what's going to happen to them. To my thinking, that requires a very special brand of courage. They will come out of that with a kind of you and me against the world feeling. It's possible they will. Let's say probable. So there's that side of it. Okay, next town down the road, they're blowing everybody off the field. They're winning all their games. They make the playoffs. They win playoff game after playoff game. And let's say that community had been divided along maybe class lines or ethnic lines or racial lines. That wasn't necessarily open. It's just kind of there. Well, football team wins and everybody's hugging on each other and everybody's all one big happy family because the team is winning. You got that too. Both of those are going on. Okay? Symbolism is extremely important in nationalism, and the war draws attention to earlier symbols and creates new ones. The flag, funny looking flag with stripes and stars and all that. During the war, in August of 1814, a British fleet having attacked and burned D.C., they damaged, there wasn't much there yet, damaged the Capitol building. The presidential mansion, later to be called the White House, was gutted to the bare walls. Okay? Their next target was Baltimore, only about 30 miles away. And to attack Baltimore, they have to reduce a big, heavily defended fort, Fort McHenry in the harbor. They did a bombardment from it, a naval bombardment, which lasted over 24 hours. It goes on through the night. They're using flares to guide their gunnery because they'd extinguished all the lights in the town so the British couldn't see it. Well, a Baltimore resident, a lawyer named Francis Scott Key, watched all this from the decks of a British ship. He'd gone out there to try to get them to release somebody as they'd picked up. And he's watching this, and they got this big old Chevy dealership size flag flying over Fort McHenry. And when these flares would go off, he could see it still there. That's very encouraging. The next morning, the dawn begins to break, and the flag is still there. He is overcome with patriotic emotion, grabs a piece of paper and a pencil, and dashes off a 4-stanza poem entitled The Star-Spangled Banner, expressing how he felt at that elevated moment. Well, it became a hugely successful poem. And by the way, poetry in the 19th century played approximately the same cultural role that popular music has since. Successful poets were rich and famous, and this made the poet rich and famous as well, Francis Scott Key. About 5 years later, somebody figured out that the words kind of almost fit the tune of an 18th century English drinking song entitled To Anacreon in Heaven. Thus was born our unofficial national anthem. It didn't become official till 1931, by which time better choices were available. Okay, our national anthem. Great song, but if you happen to be a vocalist, do you have an octave and a half range? Maybe you do. Most people don't. It's hard to sing, and it's about the flag, not about the country. I got to quit this and trim it.